There is a moment almost every believer experiences, but almost nobody talks about. You run out of options. You pray harder than you've ever prayed before. You ask God for help, a sign, a whisper, anything, and nothing happens. The room stays quiet. The problem stays exactly where it was yesterday. The prayer seems to hit the ceiling and fall back to the floor. That silence is terrifying because you were told God hears his children. So when heaven says nothing, your mind starts filling in the blanks. Maybe God is angry.
Maybe I failed. Maybe my faith isn't strong enough. Maybe God has finally moved on to someone else. The hardest part of a silent season is not the problem itself. It's the fear that the problem is proof God has forgotten you.
You know this feeling. You've prayed the same prayer for months, maybe years. You've done everything you know to do. You've repented, you've forgiven people, you've shown up when you barely had the strength to keep going. You've searched the scriptures, hoping one verse would suddenly explain everything, but nothing changes.
The bank account keeps shrinking. The diagnosis stays the same. The relationship stays broken. The loneliness stays heavy, and the silence keeps getting louder. But what if you've misunderstood the silence completely? What if God's silence is not evidence of his absence? What if it means something else entirely? Before we answer that question, we need to notice what often happens when heaven grows quiet. People start disappearing. Have you noticed that? The friends who always seemed available suddenly aren't. The mentor who always had advice has nothing to say. The people who promised they would never leave slowly fade into the background. Suddenly you're standing alone. And isolation does something dangerous. It makes you question your value. You start wondering whether you're unlovable, whether people were only around because you were useful, whether your faith is somehow pushing everyone away. It feels like abandonment. But what if that isn't what's happening? What if God is clearing the room? What if some of the voices you've depended on are becoming available for a reason? Most of us don't realize how much we rely on other people. We lean on friends for direction. We lean on family for reassurance. We lean on leaders for certainty. And sometimes those voices become so loud that we can no longer hear God clearly. So God removes the noise, not to destroy you,
To develop you, the unanswered texts, the empty room, the shrinking circle. It feels cruel when you're living through it, but sometimes God removes the crutches because he wants you to discover a strength you never knew you had. Sometimes the silence is creating a space where his voice becomes the only voice that matters. And that leads to the question every believer eventually asks. If God is still here, why won't he explain what he's doing? If God is still there, why doesn't he explain himself? Why doesn't he give you a timeline? Why doesn't he tell you when the breakthrough is coming? That question has frustrated believers for generations because waiting is exhausting. Not knowing is exhausting. The silence creates a vacuum, and something always tries to fill it, usually fear. You start imagining worst-case scenarios. Maybe I missed God's will. Maybe I failed some test. Maybe my opportunity is gone forever. The enemy loves silent seasons because he doesn't have to create new fears. He simply amplifies the ones already living in your head.
And that's why most people misunderstand what silence actually is. They see it as inactivity. God sees it as preparation. We assume that because we cannot see movement, nothing is happening. But some of the most important work God does happens completely out of sight. Not because he enjoys confusing us, because revealing the process too early would often ruin the process itself. And nowhere is that clearer than the story of Joseph. Joseph received a dream directly from God, a promise, a glimpse of a future bigger than he could imagine. Then everything fell apart. His own brothers threw him into a pit. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused, forgotten in prison. Year after year passed with no explanation. Think about that. God gave Joseph the dream, then said almost nothing while the dream seemed to be dying. Imagine sitting in that prison cell. Imagine praying the same questions over and over. God, where are you? Why would you show me a future like that if this is where I end up? Why give me a promise and then leave me here? Joseph
never got an answer. Not in the pit, not in slavery, not in prison. The silence remained. And that silence is what shaped him. Because if God had explained everything on day one, Joseph would not have needed faith. If God had said, relax, in 13 years you'll be second only to Pharaoh, Joseph would have spent those years counting days. Instead, he spent those years changing, learning, growing, becoming the man the future required. The prison wasn't where God abandoned Joseph. The prison was where God prepared Joseph. And that changes everything. Because maybe God's greatest work is not happening around you. Maybe it's happening inside you. We spend so much energy asking, why is this happening? God is often asking a different question. Who are you becoming? We want explanations. God wants transformation, and those are not always the same thing. When every prayer is answered immediately, patience never develops. When every door opens instantly, endurance never develops. When every fear disappears the moment it appears, courage never develops. But when heaven feels silent and you keep showing up anyway, something changes, not around you, inside you. And that is often the preparation you cannot see. But the preparation isn't limited to your faith. Eventually, it starts affecting everything else. You begin feeling restless. Not anxious, not depressed, just unable to settle. The life that once felt comfortable suddenly feels too small. The conversations that used to excite you feel empty. The habits you once enjoyed lose their grip. The things that once satisfied you no longer satisfy you. And because you don't understand what's happening, you assume something is wrong. But what if nothing is wrong? What if God is loosening your grip on a season you've already outgrown? One of the strangest parts of spiritual growth is that God often makes the old life uncomfortable before he reveals the new one. Not because he wants to punish you, because if the old season remained comfortable, you would never leave it. And that's where many people get stuck. They keep asking God to restore what he is trying to replace. They keep asking him to bring back what he already removed. They keep trying to rebuild a chapter that God has already finished writing. But preparation always requires separation. Not because God enjoys taking things away, because you cannot step into something new while desperately clinging to something old. And during this process, something unexpected happens. Old wounds begin to surface. Memories you thought were gone suddenly return. Old disappointments start hurting again. Pain you believed was healed feels fresh. At first, this is terrifying. You think you're moving backwards. You think all your growth was fake. You think you're becoming weaker. But that's not what's happening. God does not expose wounds to shame you. He exposes them to heal them completely. The pain isn't resurfacing because you're failing. It's resurfacing because God refuses to build your future on top of unresolved damage. The wounds that once controlled you are being brought into the light, not to destroy you, to free you. And one day, the very struggle that nearly broke you will become part of someone else's survival story. The pain will have a purpose. The scar will carry wisdom. And the thing you once wished had never happened will become evidence that God never abandoned you. That's why fighting the process is so dangerous. Many people spend their entire silent season trying to escape it. They rebuke it, resist it, panic through it. They treat the wilderness like an enemy, when in reality, the wilderness may be the workshop. The silence may be the preparation. The isolation may be the training ground. And the question changes. Instead of asking, God, why is this happening to me? You begin asking, God, what are you building in me? That question changes everything. Because now you're no longer demanding explanations. You're paying attention to transformation. And that's where the peace begins. And peace is what eventually replaces the panic. Not because all your questions get answered, but because you stop needing every answer before taking the next step. You realize something important. God never asked you to understand the entire plan. He asked you to trust his character. Those are very different things. Most of us believe trust comes after understanding. God often teaches trust before understanding.
That's why the silent season feels so uncomfortable. It forces you to decide what your faith is actually built on. Is your faith built on constant reassurance, or is it built on who God is? Because sooner or later, every believer reaches a moment where feelings cannot carry them anymore. The emotions disappear, the excitement fades, the signs stop coming, and all that remains is a decision.
Will I trust him anyway? That is where real faith is forged. Not when prayers are being answered, not when doors are opening, not when blessings are obvious. Real faith is revealed when none of those things are happening and you continue walking forward anyway. And that is why the silence feels so significant. You think God is absent because he isn't speaking. Meanwhile, God is watching something far more important. Who are you becoming when he doesn't? The silent season exposes what comfort often hides. It reveals your fears, your dependencies, your motives, the parts of your heart that still need healing. And once those things are exposed, God begins rebuilding them. Slowly, patiently, deliberately. Not because he enjoys the process, because he cares about what comes after it. Most people focus on the blessing. God focuses on the person who will eventually carry the blessing. And if the person isn't ready, the blessing becomes a burden. That's why preparation often takes longer than we want. Not because God forgot, because God is thorough. And maybe that's the message you've needed to hear this entire time. The silence is not proof that God has left. The isolation is not proof that God has abandoned you. The waiting is not proof that God has forgotten your name. Those are the conclusions fear reaches, not faith. Faith reaches a different conclusion. Faith says, I don't understand what God is doing, but I know who God is. And that changes everything. So tomorrow morning, if the room is still quiet, don't panic. If the answer still hasn't arrived, don't panic. If heaven still feels silent, don't panic. The silence is not evidence against God's presence. It may be evidence of his work. One day, you'll look back and realize the season you were most afraid of was the season that changed you the most. The season you thought was abandonment was actually preparation. The season you thought was punishment was actually construction. And the season you thought was the end was only the beginning. So stop measuring God's presence by his volume.
Stop assuming silence means absence. And stop treating this season like a mistake. The same God who was with Joseph in the prison is with you now. The same God who worked in the dark then is still working in the dark today. Your responsibility is not to force an answer. Your responsibility is to remain faithful while the work is happening. Because God's silence is not the sound of him walking away. It's often the sound of him building something you cannot see yet.